My girlfriend walked away when I was diagnosed with a terminal illness. I'm not ready to be your caregiver. But when I survived and got successful, she thought I'd take her back. She swore I was her home, her forever, the one she'd grow old with. Then she left me 3 months after I was diagnosed with stage 3 lymphoma. But what happens when the one who abandoned you suddenly wants you back, years later, when you're not just surviving, but thriving? The memory still plays in my head sometimes, a silent film of those early days. The air back then was thick with ambition and the buzz of a young city, Denver. We were caught up in it all, two young professionals thinking we had the world figured out. I met Chloe when I was 24, fresh into my role as a growth strategist for a tech startup. She was 23, working in social media marketing, and we crossed paths at one of those obligatory networking events nobody truly wants to attend. She had this vibrant energy, like she was always on stage, always curating how every moment would look for some future story. I was her complete opposite. I was the guy buried in spreadsheets, the one who found confidence in actually building things, not just talking about them. We clicked immediately, or at least, I genuinely believed we did. That first night, she snapped a photo of us, posting it with a caption about unexpected connections. It felt a little much, even back then, but I also found it kind of charming. Within 3 months, she was living with me in my Lodo apartment. Within 6, she was talking about marriage, kids, the whole package. Looking back now, it's clear we were speaking entirely different languages. When Chloe spoke of our future, she was picturing an aesthetic, a perfect narrative. When I spoke of ours, I was thinking retirement accounts, career priorities, and what we'd do if one of us ever got sick. I actually brought that up once, the getting sick part, and she just laughed it off, saying we were too young for such serious thoughts. I didn't push it. I was 25, healthy, and naive enough to think planning for disaster was the same as preventing it. The diagnosis landed like a punch on a regular October afternoon. For weeks, I'd been battling persistent fatigue, inexplicable weight loss, and a cough that just wouldn't quit. My doctor ordered tests, then more tests, and suddenly I was sitting in an oncology office. Non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Stage 3. Aggressive. Treatment needed to start immediately. Words like chemotherapy hung in the air. I just sat there, nodding, pretending to comprehend, but my mind was screaming about Chloe. How would I tell her? How would this change everything? I called her from the parking lot. She came right away. When I told her, she broke down, crying harder than I did. She held my face, her voice raw with emotion. We're going to fight this together. I promise I'm not going anywhere. And I believed her, absolutely. For the first few weeks, she was incredible. Every appointment, every note taken when my brain felt too scrambled to focus, every diet and supplement researched. She even posted about it. Not in a truly gross way, but in that performative support kind of way. Articles about cancer survival rates with captions like staying strong, heart emojis from her friends, and her meticulously crafted responses. I hated the public nature of my illness, but I rationalized it, telling myself she was processing it her own way, that she needed her own support system. What I didn't see then was that she was building a narrative where she was the devoted girlfriend, and narratives like that only work if there's an audience watching. Chemotherapy began in November. It was exactly as horrible as everyone says, the nausea, the soul-crushing exhaustion, the metallic taste, watching my hair fall out in clumps. But worse than all that was watching Chloe slowly disappear. Not physically, at first. She still came to the hospital, still sat in that chair beside my bed, but mentally, she was miles away. She'd scroll through her phone during infusions. When I tried to talk about how terrified I was, she'd reply, "I know, baby." Me, too, but it sounded distant, like she was reading lines from a script. The posts about my illness stopped around week 3. When I asked, she said, "I just need some privacy right now. This is really hard for me." I didn't know how to tell her it was harder for me without sounding selfish. By December, she was making maybe half my appointments. Always an excuse: work, not feeling well, needing to take care of her mental health. That last one gnawed at me. What was I supposed to say? That her mental health was less important than my literal cancer? I wasn't that person. So, I just said I understood and tried not to think about facing the scariest thing in my life essentially alone. My parents lived across the country and could only visit once a month. My brother was overseas. It was supposed to be Chloe and me against this thing. But increasingly, it was just me. The breaking point arrived in early January at a coffee shop near my apartment. I'd just finished my worst round of chemo yet, barely able to keep water down. Chloe had asked to meet, to talk. I knew what was coming before she even spoke. I saw it in the way she avoided my gaze, the way she was already crying before the conversation truly began. I can't do this anymore, Ethan. I just can't. I asked what she meant, even though I already knew. She wasn't ready to be a caregiver, too young to spend her life in hospitals. She deserved to live instead of watching someone die. That last part, the casual certainty that I was dying, like it was a decided fate, that's what got me. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just sat there, letting her say everything she needed to say. I think she wanted me to fight for us, to beg her to stay, because when I didn't, she looked almost offended. Say something, she whispered. I hope you find what you're looking for, I said. And that was it. She blocked my number that night, every social media platform, even blocked my family when my mom tried to reach out. It was like I had died already, and she was simply moving on with her life. Later, through a mutual friend, I found out she'd posted something about choosing herself, setting boundaries, healing from toxic relationships. People were cheering her on, treating her like the victim. I was bald, nauseous, alone in my apartment, genuinely unsure if I'd survive the next 6 months. And she was being praised for her bravery in leaving. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here's what I realized in those months after she left, when I was at my absolute lowest, with nobody there to witness it. Chloe didn't leave because I was sick. She left because I became a risk. As long as I was healthy, successful, building a good life, I was a worthwhile investment. The moment I became uncertain, the moment loving me required actual sacrifice instead of just Instagram captions, I stopped being worth it. She wasn't a monster. She was just someone who loved the idea of me more than the reality. And when those two things stopped matching up, she chose herself. Part of me doesn't even blame her for that. But here's the thing nobody tells you about rock bottom: it's surprisingly stable. Once you're there, once you've lost everything you thought mattered, you stop living for other people's approval. You start living because you're still breathing, and you might as well do something with that. Lying in a hospital bed in February, alone save for the nurses and doctors, I made a decision. If I was going to die, I was going to die building something that mattered. If I was going to live, I was going to live for someone who chose me without guarantees. The doctors gave me a 30% chance of survival. For the first month after Chloe left, I honestly wondered if I even wanted to beat those odds. That's the part nobody talks about with cancer. It's not just your body fighting. It's your mind deciding if the fight is worth it. And when you're alone at 3 a.m, throwing up into a hospital toilet, the answer isn't always obvious. But somewhere around late February, something shifted. I was in my hospital bed after a particularly brutal chemo session, and I opened my laptop. I looked at the business plan I'd been working on before the diagnosis, a growth strategy framework I'd developed for scaling startups. I'd shown it to Chloe once. She'd said it was cool but asked when it would make real money. I'd shelved it, busy, considering it a side project. Now, I had nothing but time. If I was going to die anyway, I might as well die working on something that truly mattered to me. I started rebuilding the framework from my hospital bed, reaching out to former clients via email, offering consulting sessions for cheap, just to keep my mind occupied. The work was slow. Some days I couldn't get out of bed, some days the brain fog from treatment was so severe I couldn't form coherent sentences. But I kept at it. My doctor said keeping busy might actually help, that patients with purpose tended to respond better to treatment. I didn't know if that was real science or just something he told dying people, but I didn't care. By March, I had 3 clients. By April, 7. By May, I realized I was building something that could actually scale. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was planning a future I might not live to see. But that's what hope looks like when you're dying, it's working anyway. That's when I met Olivia. She was one of the oncology nurses on my floor, late 20s, with this completely no-nonsense attitude I appreciated after months of people tiptoeing around me like I was already a corpse. She didn't do the sad voice. Didn't treat me like I was fragile. She just came in, did her job, and occasionally told me to stop being dramatic when I complained about the nausea. Our first real conversation happened in June. She caught me working on my laptop at 2 in the morning and asked what I was doing awake. I told her I'd rest when I was dead, and she made some comment about how, at this rate, that would be sooner than I thought. I actually laughed for the first time in months. She sat down, asked what I was working on, and I explained the whole framework, expecting her to get bored or offer some platitude. Instead, she asked specific questions about market positioning and customer acquisition, showing she was genuinely listening. After that, she'd stop by during her breaks, and we'd talk. Not about cancer, not about my chances, just normal stuff. She told me about her nightmare roommate who kept adopting cats without asking, about her family in Boise, about how she'd wanted to be a pediatric nurse but couldn't handle seeing sick kids, so she chose oncology instead because at least adults understood what was happening to them. I told her about my work, about Denver, about everything except Chloe, because what was there to say? That conversation became routine. Whenever Olivia was on shift, she'd find 20 minutes just to sit and be normal with me. I started looking forward to it more than I wanted to admit. She never asked about my personal life, never pushed. There was something incredibly freeing about being around someone who only knew sick me, who didn't have the before version to compare me to. The remission news came in August, almost 10 months after my diagnosis. My oncologist said the tumors had shrunk significantly, that the treatment was working better than expected. I'd need continued monitoring, but I was officially in remission. I called my parents first, and they cried. I called my brother, who said he'd visit as soon as his leave came through. Then I just sat in my apartment, alone, trying to process that I was actually going to live. Olivia stopped by later that evening. She wasn't even on shift, but she'd heard the news. She brought Thai food and made some joke about how I couldn't use the death excuse to get out of things anymore. We ate on my couch and didn't talk about the fact that I'd survived. We just existed in that moment. I remember thinking, this is what contentment feels like. Not excitement or relief, just quiet gratitude for being alive and having someone who cared without needing anything from me. My business took off after that. Turns out, having a near-death experience makes you incredibly good at prioritizing what matters in business strategy, and clients started seeking me out specifically for my approach. The growth happened faster than I expected. By November, I'd hired 2 contractors. By January of the following year, I'd moved into a small office space in downtown Denver, and by March, I was making more money than I'd ever made at my old startup job. I wasn't rich, but I was stable, successful, building something real. Olivia and I had started seeing each other outside the hospital sometime around October. Nothing official, just coffee or dinner when her shifts allowed, and it felt easy in a way relationships never had before. She never asked about our future plans, never pushed for labels or timelines. She just showed up and let things develop naturally. I told her once that I appreciated how low pressure everything felt with her. She said something about how she'd seen me when I thought I was dying, so everything after that was just bonus. That hit me harder than it should have, the casual way she acknowledged she'd chosen me when there was no guarantee of a future, when loving me was actually a risk. That's when Chloe came back into my life. It was April, over 2 years since she'd left, and I got a message request on LinkedIn from her. She'd unblocked me, apparently. The message said she'd heard I was doing well, and she was so happy for me that she'd always known I was strong enough to beat it. The exclamation point bothered me more than it should have. An hour later, she followed up, saying she knew it had been a long time, but she'd really love to reconnect, that she'd done a lot of growing and thought I'd be proud of the person she'd become. I stared at those messages for a long time, trying to figure out what I felt. The answer was nothing, just a mild curiosity about what could possibly make her think I'd want to hear from her now. I didn't respond immediately, but she kept trying. Messages about how she'd been following my company's growth, how she'd always believed in my potential, how she'd thought about me often over the past 2 years. That last one, that's what made me angry in a way the rest didn't. Because if she'd thought about me so often, she could have unblocked me at any point during the months when I actually needed someone. She could have checked in when I was bald and vomiting and uncertain. But she only came back when checking in was safe, when I was successful again, when loving me was convenient. I showed the messages to Olivia one night. She read them without saying anything, then handed my phone back and asked what I wanted to do. Not what should you do, no opinion, just what do you want? I said I didn't know yet, and she told me to figure it out, but not to let Chloe make me forget who was actually there when it mattered. Then she went back to reading her book, like we'd just been discussing what to order for dinner. Chloe eventually asked to meet in person, claiming she wanted closure or to explain herself. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at the same coffee shop where she'd broken up with me. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. Physically, she looked the same, but there was this desperate energy, like she was trying too hard to seem casual. She ordered some complicated drink, sat down, and immediately launched into how mature she was now, how she'd been in therapy, how she understood she'd handled things badly, but she'd been young and scared. She talked for almost 20 minutes about her journey of self-discovery, the work she'd done on herself, how she'd realized what truly mattered in life. Then she said, "If I'd known you were going to survive, that things would turn out okay, maybe I would have made different choices." And that single sentence told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't come back because she'd realized she loved me. She'd come back because I'd become a safe bet again, because the risk had passed. Suddenly, I was worth the investment again. I let her keep talking, explaining, justifying, rationalizing. When she finally stopped and looked at me expectantly, I realized she thought this was working, that I was going to take her back. She reached across the table for my hand and said, "I never stopped caring about you, Ethan. I just needed time to become someone strong enough to handle hard things." I pulled my hand back. "You needed time," I said, "or you needed me to stop being a hard thing?" She didn't have an answer for that. I stood up and told her I appreciated her honesty, but I'd moved on. She actually looked shocked, like it hadn't occurred to her that I might not want her back. As I walked out, I heard her ask if there was someone else. I didn't answer, because it wasn't about Olivia. It was about the fact that Chloe had shown me exactly who she was when things got difficult, and I decided to believe her. I called Olivia from my car and told her about the meeting. She asked how I felt, and I said I felt free, like I'd finally closed a chapter one hadn't even realized was still open. She told me she'd just adopted another cat, and her roommate was going to remove her, so she might need a place to crash. I laughed and told her to come over. That night, sitting on my couch with Olivia and her newest rescue cat, I realized this was what I'd survived for. Not the success, or the money, or the vindication. But the quiet, simple joy of being chosen by someone who'd seen me at my worst and stayed anyway. Olivia moved in 3 weeks after that coffee shop meeting with Chloe. Not because of some grand romantic gesture, but because her roommate actually did kick her out over the cat situation, and my apartment was bigger anyway. It felt natural, the way good things do when they're not forced. I remember thinking how different this was from living with Chloe. How there was no performance to it, no checking in with each other before posting photos, no narrative we were trying to sell to the world. Olivia just existed in my space like she'd always been there, leaving her nursing scrubs on the bathroom floor and stealing my coffee in the mornings. And it was mundane and perfect in a way I hadn't known relationships could be. Chloe didn't stop trying after that first meeting. She started texting from new numbers I didn't have blocked, always late at night, probably drinking, feeling nostalgic for a version of us that never actually existed. The messages were long and rambling about how she'd made a mistake, how she'd been too immature to handle the situation properly, how if I'd just give her another chance, she could prove she was different now. She sent articles about forgiveness and second chances, quoted some podcast about how people deserve grace for their worst moments, told me she'd been seeing a therapist who helped her understand she'd been dealing with her own trauma when she left. I didn't respond to any of it, but I didn't block the number either, because part of me needed to see how far she'd go, needed confirmation that my read of the situation was correct. The messages escalated over the next few weeks. She started showing up places she thought I might be, the coffee shop near my office, the gym I'd rejoined after getting cleared by my doctor, even the Thai restaurant where Olivia and I got takeout sometimes. It never felt threatening, exactly. More pathetic than anything, like she was trying to manufacture a chance encounter that would make me realize what I was missing. Once, she actually waited outside my office building and tried to talk to me as I was leaving. She started going on about how she'd been doing a lot of thinking about us, about our history, about everything we'd built together before things went wrong. I told her we hadn't built anything together, that she'd been an observer to my life, not a participant. She looked at me like I'd slapped her. She said something about how she'd loved me, and I told her she'd loved the version of me that was convenient for her. Then I walked away before she could respond. Olivia noticed I was distracted, asked if everything was okay. I showed her the messages. She read through them with an increasingly annoyed expression, and finally asked if I wanted her to talk to Chloe. She said, sometimes it takes hearing it from another woman for the message to sink in. Maybe if Chloe understood I'd actually moved on, she'd stop living in this fantasy where we were going to get back together. I told her I didn't want her involved in my mess. She said my mess was her mess now, and that was kind of how relationships worked. So, I gave her Chloe's number and honestly didn't think much would come of it. Olivia called Chloe the next day while I was at work. I don't know exactly what was said because Olivia refused to give me details, just said she'd handled it with a satisfied expression that made me nervous and a little proud at the same time. But whatever she said worked, because the messages from Chloe stopped completely for about 3 days. Then I got one final text, longer than all the others combined. This whole thing about how she couldn't believe I'd chosen someone who didn't know the real me, who hadn't been there for the good times, who was essentially a stranger compared to our shared history. She said, she only knows sick you, broken you. She doesn't know who you were before all this. And I realized that was exactly the point. Olivia knew me without the mythology, without the comparison to who I used to be or who I might become. She'd met me at my absolute worst and decided I was enough exactly as I was. And that was worth more than any shared history or nostalgia for better times. I wrote back my first response in weeks and said, "You're right. She doesn't know who I was before, but unlike you, she didn't need that version of me to decide I was worth staying for." I blocked the number after sending it and felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no sadness, just relief that this chapter was finally, truly closed. The final confrontation came in June, almost 3 months after that first coffee shop meeting. Olivia and I were at a networking event for my company, and Chloe showed up. I still don't know how she found out. Maybe she'd been following my company's social media, or she heard through mutual connections we still had in Denver's tech scene. But she walked in wearing this dress that was clearly expensive and clearly chosen to remind me of what I was missing. She didn't approach me immediately, just sort of hovered near the bar, watching me. I could feel Olivia tense up beside me when she realized who it was. Chloe finally came over when Olivia went to the restroom. She had this weird smile on her face, like we were old friends running into each other unexpectedly. She said she'd seen my company was doing well, that she wasn't surprised because she'd always known I had potential. I didn't say anything, just waited for her to get to the point. She started talking about how she'd made a mistake and thought I knew that, implied that was why I couldn't fully move on. I told her I had fully moved on, that I was happy, and she actually laughed like I'd said something funny. She said, "You're settling for someone who saw you at your weakest." Don't you see how that's just fear? You're afraid of being with someone who expects you to be great. And that's when I realized she genuinely believed this. That in her mind, she was the victim. That I was making a mistake by choosing stability over whatever chaotic energy she thought passed for passion. Olivia came back before I could respond. She looked at Chloe for a long moment before introducing herself in this bright, cheerful voice that somehow made everything more uncomfortable. She said how she'd heard so much about Chloe, how it must be difficult seeing me doing well without her, how she hoped Chloe found whatever she was looking for. There was nothing overtly mean about what Olivia said, but the subtext was clear, and Chloe just stood there, looking between us, before saying something about how we didn't know what she and I had together, then walking away. We watched her leave, and Olivia turned to me and asked if she'd overstepped. I kissed her right there, in the middle of my networking event, in front of everyone. That was the last time I saw Chloe. I heard through friends that she moved to Los Angeles a few months later, something about a new job and wanting a fresh start. And I hoped she found whatever she was looking for, genuinely. Not because I forgave her, or because I thought we could ever be friends, but because holding on to anger would mean she still mattered. And she didn't. What mattered was the woman who'd chosen me without guarantees, who'd seen me at my worst and decided to stay, who didn't need me to be successful, or healthy, or impressive to think I was worth her time. 2 years later, I'm cancer-free, and my company is thriving. Olivia and I got engaged last month. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if Chloe had stayed, if she'd been strong enough to handle the hard parts. And I realize we still would have ended eventually because we were fundamentally incompatible. She needed someone who looked good in her story, and I needed someone who'd stay when the story got ugly. People ask me sometimes if I feel bad about not giving Chloe another chance, if I think I was too harsh or unforgiving. The answer is no. Forgiveness doesn't mean reopening doors that closed for good reasons. Chloe showed me exactly who she was when life got difficult, when loving me required actual sacrifice instead of just Instagram captions and coffee dates. She made her choice, and I respected it enough not to pretend it didn't happen just because circumstances changed. I survived cancer, built a successful business, and found someone who chose me without needing proof I'd be worth the investment. Chloe wanted back in when the risk was gone, when I was safe again. And that's not love. That's just opportunism dressed up in therapy language and second-chance rhetoric. So, do you think I was wrong for not taking back my ex-girlfriend who left me when I was dying, but wanted back when I survived and became successful?